All right, please be seated. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Peaceful Solution Teacher Certification Training Course. It's great to see everybody here and all of you that are online also. We look forward to having you stay with us for the duration. We are in the self-control book right there. See what it looks like there with the stop sign. And we'll be reverting back, of course, to the character unit, possibly the acceptance unit from time to time also, as we continue learning about positive moral character. And in fact, this self-control that we're learning about right now is required. I mean, you've got to have it to even to develop positive character. It's a must, you know. It's not a possibly. Self-control is actually the foundation of moral behavior. So what we'd like to do is go ahead and turn on over to page 7. Page 7 in our self-control book. And page 7 is entitled, Why Do I Need to Have Self-Control? So we're going to be kind of going back and forth a little bit in order to make sure that we touch on everything and help bring some things to remembrance. And one thing that we always should do, of course, if you've got your lesson together, and just to point out to you, since you are teachers in training, is that we always look back on the lesson plan and make sure that we're going according to the procedures that are lined out. It is a guide for us to follow. In fact, in procedure number 3, now we're still on page 7, and right now we're finishing up with that just after a little review. But looking at that procedure number 3, we will be starting on page 8 after we finish up with 7 here. And it says to emphasize to students that because self-control is so important to society, it is the first step of character development. Right, it's the foundation. And then it continues on and says, instruct students to read the importance of self-control. Now remember why we went back here and looked at this. Page 5, 6, and 7 isn't actually listed physically in the procedures right here, but it was a continuation of the previous procedure. Another page that you will find that is not actually listed here is when we start on page 8, it kind of jumps to page 10, but page 8 and 9 go together. So let's go ahead back over to page 7. And just to finish up there, in a brief review, why do I need to have self-control? Well, when you can control your thoughts, feelings, and actions, you will make choices that will not cause harm to yourself or others, or property and the environment. In fact, on the previous page, if you look over there on page 6, it talks about what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. Now, that's about possessions of others and not trespassing on their property. In fact, in your character unit, see if I remember what page it's on. But in your character unit, on page 10 and 11, there's like a whole section right there that's actually titled the same. What's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And it's talking about moral character in relation to possessions and property. And just to kind of summarize it a little bit, it starts out and says, behaving morally in regards to possessions and property of others means to recognize that everyone owns things and values what they own. What one person values, another might not, but it's still necessary to respect the possessions of others. And behaving morally, another way to say that is keeping the rules. You are keeping the rules when you're behaving morally. But there's a whole lot covered there. And if you do have a character unit, it'd be great to go back and read pages 10 and 11 and see what values have to do with self-control. I think we focused on it a little bit here in the last class, and prior to that also, actually at the start of it. Let's see, I think William started out, and then Catan covered a couple of the pages, and then we ended up where we're at now on page 7. So let's drop down to the second paragraph on page 7. In fact, not only do you need to have self-control, but everyone needs to have self-control as well. Everyone, yes. When was the last time you watched the news or read the newspaper? Have you noticed how many reports of murder, child molestations, domestic violence, assaults, and thefts are reported, really daily? Every day you find, I don't care if you're watching world news, local news, there's always some kind of crime that's talked about on there. There never is a day that goes by where it's not there. It's always there. They don't ever take a day off. So when even a few people within our society lack self-control, the results are crime, fear, anxiety, and hatred. And, everybody lacks self-control. Unless you've been learning the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, you don't really have a firm grasp of what self-control even is. There's just nobody out there teaching it to the degree that the Peaceful Solution does. And that's why we're here. We're here to learn, and then we want to teach what we've learned. But you must learn it first. Excuse me. So, of course, there's our stop sign. It says stop and think. And I won't go much further on that right now. You'll be introduced to something soon enough. But what are other ways of a lack of self-control, or other ways a lack of self-control affects society today? And, of course, there's many things, divorces, school shootings, STDs, the massive amount that's spent on security in businesses and stores and even homes. Now it's quite common to see the different type of doorbells that have the camera on it, which go directly to your phones, so wherever you're at, you can see who's at your door, and even talk to them through the phone and through the doorbell, through the speaker, and kind of keep an eye on your home. But there's a lot of money spent on that everywhere, all throughout society. It's not just here in the United States. It's all over the world. Creating a worldwide market for those type of products, of course, but there's no safety. Remember, there's no living in peace, true peace and security and safety at this time. Now, a quote at the bottom says, each person is obligated, see that, obligated, to consider how their actions affect others. We want to do that. There's a ripple effect that takes place from our actions, whether it be positive or whether it be negative. It doesn't stop with us, and it doesn't stop with the person, right next to us, or, we don't even know how far down the line it just continues to go. What I say and what I do affects you, myself, everyone around me, and then it affects you, it affects your family, it affects the people you deal with, and then those people too, then whatever affected them by the way you were behaving, then they display to other people. It just keeps on and on and on. You've heard that it runs downhill. Well, that's kind of how it goes. But it's like, just imagine a rock being dropped in the water, and that ripple, it just keeps on going. Okay. So this is why we need self-control, and why each person is obligated to consider how their actions affect others. You should. Let's go ahead and turn on over to page 8. Remember, we just talked about the procedure number 3, and it says that, and we have emphasized that self-control is the first step, the foundation of moral character. Instruct students to read the importance of self-control, found on page 8, and that's what we're fixing to do right now. And we're going to carry on over through page 9 before we go to page 10. So at the top of the page, it says the real test of self-control is what you do when no one is looking. Now, there we go. That's the key right there. When you think no one's looking, When you think your parents aren't there looking, when you think your supervisor's not looking, when you think the authority over you is not looking, um, that's when self-control comes into play. What are you going to do? What are you going to do if there's no one there to correct you? Think about that. So self-control is needed in every situation, and it is every situation. Everybody practices self-control to some degree. Now, not everybody practices self-control to the degree that we want to see in the peaceful solution, the degree that that will bring peace and safety and security in this world, okay? Not everybody does, but everybody practices self-control to some degree. In fact, you need self-control whether you're alone, interacting with others at school, home, work, even when you're having fun. I mean, self-control enables you to speak and behave appropriately. If you were in similar to a class like tonight, all of you out here in front of me are practicing self-control. I don't see any of you jumping up and dancing on the table or throwing books around or shooting spit wads at each other or anything like that. So there's some self-control taking place here. You're not throwing things up here at the stage. You seem to all be intently listening to what's going on. I'm sure those of you out there on the internet too. But you are practicing self-control, see? So we just need to do it all the time. That's the key. So self-control enables you to speak and behave appropriately regardless of the choices that are placed before you or the situation that you're in. In fact, self-control is so important that it's probably one of the first character traits that you were taught how to develop. Now think about that for a moment, what it just said. How would that be so? It was probably one of the first character traits that you were taught how to develop. Well, let's take a look. Can you recall your parents reminding you not to touch something because it was hot? Not to run around the room because you could fall? Not to touch someone else's belongings because it wasn't yours? You remember those things? That was teaching you self-control. As a child, it was the job of your parents and teachers to help you to develop self-control by instructing and reminding you about appropriate behavior. And if you look at the little, peace tune character there, the boy's reaching for something and the parent says, "No, sweetie, don't touch that." Then he's running and the parent says, "No, sweetie, don't run in the room. You could trip and hurt yourself." And then he just sits down and says, "Well, what can I do then?" But at least he was obedient, but he was being taught self-control, and hopefully he will remember those things. So he's being taught the way to conduct himself in these situations. So, one of the things that we want to try to do, I just wanted to touch on this, I had a little note here, but one of the things that we always want to try to do, it's just like the parent reminding the child not to touch something because it was hot, or not to touch someone else's belongings because it wasn't theirs. You need to learn to ask. Asking is so very important to get the answer. It's either yes or it's no. And in the peaceful solution, as we go along, we learn that asking is so extremely important, but so is our ability to accept whatever that answer is, whether it be yes or, whether it be no. We just need to accept it. We don't need to try to bully the person into changing their answer from no to yes. We don't need to try to coerce and entice and blackmail or extort the person into changing their answer. We need to accept what their answer is. Some people, have experienced being told no so many times, but obviously not enough. If you get told no enough, and you learn to accept it, then you've achieved something. Usually when a person doesn't like accepting the answer no, it's because they haven't been told no enough. You've got to experience that no plenty of times before you can get to the point to where you appreciate it. And you can think about your own self and how when you're asked something and you tell the person no, you shouldn't have to feel, embarrassed or that you're doing something wrong or you're going to hurt the person or whatever. You shouldn't need to feel those type of things. You should be comfortable with saying no if that's the answer. I didn't mean to get too far into that, but the old adage out there is, it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is for permission. I mean, that's what they say. I remember being taught that many times. No, we ain't gonna ask. We're just gonna do it, and then we'll ask about it. We'll just tell them we're sorry. But that's what a lack of self-control does. It leads to other things and doing things wrong. All right, so what other instructions are children given to help them develop the positive trait of self-control? And, of course, it says to list 3 on the lines below, which if you've got a book, possibly you've already done that. Possibly you haven't, I don't know. But, what are some of the things? What are some of the other things that you can think? Think about it for just a minute. And jot it down if you want to, if you have a book. But think about the other things that instructions that children are given to help them develop the positive trait of self-control. Of course, I've got the teacher's manual, and there's a few suggestions here too, but adults and children alike, when they can learn to practice the proper tone of voice, using the proper tone of voice with each other. Tones of voice mean a lot. We have a whole chapter coming up about tone of voice and the look on your face and all these things, and how that communication really means a lot more than the words you're even saying sometimes. Also instructing children to take turns. Don't shove, don't push. We encourage children to share, but if it's their possession, then they have the right to say yes or no on if they want to share that item or not. And we need to encourage and develop that, not make them feel like they need to change their answer. I remember in a daycare, the person, forcing someone to share. Like if someone had an item, it could be, a toy or something, or a computer, or, who knows, whatever, but something that they value, and, someone else wanted to use it, and the person, the owner of the property, which could be a child, said no. And so then the daycare, the bully, the one that's trying to change his mind, started crying, and the teacher comes over and says, "What are you crying about?" Like he's the victim, and William won't share with me, and then the teacher yells at William and says, "You share your stuff. You should be sharing," and that's just building it up in the bully's mind. That's just building a bigger bully than what he was already. We need to learn to be able to accept the answer no. And that's part of self-control. That's a big deal, man. Getting told no, you've got to have self-control to really accept that and appreciate it. Some people might accept it and walk off. Well, I'll see if I let you borrow anything or whatever, But if you can accept it and appreciate it, that the person has that right to say yes or no, now you're getting somewhere. That's awesome when that can occur. So let's go on over to page 9, the unlisted page, if you will, in the lesson plan. I just wanted to point that out again, because sometimes you will run across in the lesson plan and the procedures, it won't absolutely say a page, especially if it was a continuation of another page, which obviously this is, And so just keep that in mind. It doesn't mean just skip it and go to, like if we go back, let's go back and look at it in a minute. On lesson plan 1, page F, procedure 3, it says the importance of self-control, instruct students to read it, found on page 8, and then self-control develops other traits, found on page 10. Well, we don't just skip page 9 and jump to page 10, see? We want to follow through, okay? All right, so we know where we're going after page 9 and then page 10. All right, so let's look at 9. Now that you're growing up, it is up to you to take responsibility for keeping yourself in control. Okay, that's a big deal right there. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Remember that word responsibility. You can no longer expect your parents, your teachers, your any kind of authority that you can think of, your boss, whatever, to remind you of proper behavior. You should now be able to distinguish between right and wrong. Think about that. You know, back in the mentioning right and wrong, back there in the character unit again, on page 8. On page 8, you know, morals. They're that these moral values. They're that line. They're that line between right and wrong. You know, it can be divided into these categories. Of course, the behavior and attitude towards all life, possessions and property, and also the environment. Okay, so remember that picture. Let me show it to you for those of you that might not have a book. But right and wrong, and there's that line in between, right? So you can know the difference between right and wrong, and that's what we're talking about right here. All right, in other words, you are now accountable for. Accountable for? What does that mean? Well, you have knowledge now. Knowledge is power. And then with power, guess what comes with it? You've got to, with power, there comes a responsibility with that power for you to be able to use it properly. Some people gain knowledge and they want to use that against other people so that they can have the upper hand, you know. They manipulate and play games and with the knowledge that they have that the other person might not have, and, you know, getting the upper hand. And that's not the proper way to deal with the knowledge that you have. You have a responsibility to treat others with respect and care and concern. That's your responsibility. So as you gain this knowledge, remember, you do have that responsibility handed to you that goes along with it, and you have to deal with it properly. You have to go back and you have to figure out what's right and wrong when you're using this knowledge, okay? So, in other words, you're now accountable for the decisions you make, how you behave, and how you treat others. Even though you've been developing self-control through the guidance of adults in your life, it's now up to you to determine to practice self-control of your own free will. Now, if you have to be forced, you're not practicing self-control. In fact, you know, it continues and says that, but keep in mind that if you have to be forced or constantly reminded to follow an instruction, let me read that again. Keep in mind that if you have to be forced or constantly reminded to follow an instruction, then you are not practicing self-control. Now, we expect that out of children to some degree. We expect that we're going to have to tell them over and over again. Though we would like to see, when we tell them the first time, we would like to see some obedience. They really need to. But, you know, 2 days down the road, we might have to tell them again. And then a couple of days down the road, we might have to tell them again. Or we might have to tell them several times in one day. You know, it's the same thing when training somebody on a job, for instance, you know, for any type of supervisor or authority. You know, you've got to constantly remind people what the instructions are, you know, and what to follow and how to, like, use the machine, for instance. If the, you know, complicated machine with a bunch of buttons to press, well, they're going to have to hear it and practice it more than once before they get it down right, you know. So it's important to get that to where it is now a part of their behavior. You know, you could say habit, but a part of their behavior. So it's important to understand that self-control is about what you do and the choices you make. Now, you know, talking about choices, a choice is something that you make, you know. nobody makes the choice for you. In fact, if you say, well, I don't know if I want a hamburger or a taco, you choose for me. Well, someone might say, well, let's get the burger. Well, then you have to make the choice to abide by that. So there's still a choice involved. See, it's not up to someone else. It's up to you, and you have to learn those choices. You have to learn to discern the difference between right and wrong. With this power that you have, with this knowledge you have to discern the differences. And when you're not under the direct supervision of authority, that says in the book Adults, I put authority there because it could be adults, but it could be another type of authority also. It might be it might be a police officer at a traffic stop or something. There's an authority there that you have a choice to do things that are right, or else have this police officer pull you over in a traffic situation, and then you're going to be under his direct supervision for a little bit, and you're probably going to be thinking a little bit harder about the choices that you make when with your behavior with the police officer, right? So let me read that again. It's important to understand that self-control is about what you do and the choices you make, especially when you're not under the direct supervision of the adults or authority. It's kind of like going back to the top of page 8 where it says the real test of self-control is what you do when no one is looking. You don't get by with anything. If you think you're doing something because no one sees you, man, I'll tell you, it would be we would all be surprised if we knew exactly how many cameras were out there watching our every move. Even if someone could be halfway across the parking lot and have their camera out taking a picture, and you could be doing something thinking no one is seeing you, and that can be picked up on their phone and then found out at some time in the future. Hey, what's that guy doing there? And they zoom on in. Hey, isn't that, I mean, think about it. Or the times that you're walking in a store, not really paying attention, you're just you're going in to get something real quick and all, and you were on camera when you pulled on the parking lot. You were on camera before you pulled in the parking lot because there was another business nearby that got you on camera. Or the street sign camera, or so in your daily trek, wherever you go, there's people watching all the time. They might not be focused on you at the moment, but they can always pull back up if something occurs and say, hey, here's what's going on here. All right. So self-control must come from within you and must be practiced consistently. That's the thing that we need to do, is learn about consistency with self-control. Because, like I said before, everybody practices self-control to some degree. You practice self-control when you came to the class. You practice self-control when you sat down at the table and didn't make a lot of noise. You practice self-control when you pulled out your book. You practice self-control when you put on your mask. I could go on and on and on. But are we going to continue practicing self-control when nobody is looking? That really is the key, because, like I said, I can look out here right now and see everyone out here, and I would say, everybody's doing a great job practicing self-control. But I don't know what the majority of you are going to do directly after this class, and what you might get into, or if you might get in an argument or something, or might go squealing the tires when you take off, or who knows, I don't know. But remember that when no one's looking, someone really is. But this needs to come from within. You got to choose. You have to choose to want to be right about things, to practice self-control. You got to be willing to guide and direct your thoughts, your feelings, and actions at all times. Is that a hard thing to do? Yes, it is a hard thing to do, I can tell you. And that's why we need to guard. Well, there's a page coming up that says guard your mind, but we've talked about influences a bit to this point. And And we already know that influences have that ability to affect your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions. These influences do. And influences can affect you in a positive manner or in a negative manner. It's what you do with it. Just because there's an influence out there and a negative influence out there doesn't mean that you have to latch onto it and do whatever it is that you're being influenced to do. You can set your mind in advance, and you can guard against that negative influence so that you can make right choices, and you're guiding and directing those thoughts and feelings and actions at all times. That influence, that song that you hear that takes you back, 10 or 15 years or 20 years or whenever to a time when you were doing something that might have some certain place in your memory. It can take you back there like that in just a split second, and then there you are. What are you going to do with that memory that comes up? Are you going to act on it? Or are you going to wallow around in it a little bit? Or are you going to think, oh man, things were so much better then? I was free. I could do what I wanted. Well, when you're practicing self-control, like I said, there's a responsibility that goes with it. So you're no longer free to act a fool with the knowledge that you have. You've got a responsibility. And that's the only reason you're not free to do something with it. You have that responsibility. Yeah, it's almost like it's almost like you're in. I can't say that it's like you're in prison or that you have that you're tied up with a rope around you or something, because then that would be force. It wouldn't be choice. But with responsibility and with that knowledge, you have that choice to tie yourself down, to limit your conduct to the right conduct instead of the wrong conduct. And it's hard to do, man. You can be influenced like that, like I said, and your mouth can just start going. So you got to be willing to guide and direct those thoughts and feelings and actions at all time. And for example, if you're honest one day but dishonest the next, guess what? Then you're not consistently practicing self-control to maintain the character trait of honesty, and you will be considered a dishonest person. Enough people will deal with you that they will, share that information and say, he's dishonest, man. Don't go around him. If you're respectful to adults, supervisors, authority, while in their presence, but disrespectful when they're not around, it goes back to the real test of self-control, is what you do when no one's looking. So if you're respectful when they're around, when you're in their presence, but disrespectful when they're not around, then you are not consistently practicing this positive character trait of self-control to maintain the character traits of respect. Consistency and self-control go hand in hand. Well, the word respect back there for just a minute, that word respect is showing true care and concern towards others as you would have them show to you also. If you don't like someone talking about you, don't talk about them. If you don't like someone stealing your belongings, don't steal their belongings. If you don't like somebody spitting on your car, don't spit on their car. If you don't like someone leaning on your car, then don't lean on theirs, If you don't like it, don't do it to someone else. That's the main thing. If we could remember that, man, if we could remember that one thing right there, what a better place it would be to live. Because there would be nobody saying, hey, you know what so-and-so said about me? Or you know what so-and-so said about you? Or, all this fighting and arguing. There would be no fist fights. There would be no knifings. There would be no car thefts. There would be no rapes and kidnapping and on and on and on. There just wouldn't be any, because people would be treating others like they want to be treated. That's such a big deal. So consistency and self-control go hand in hand. And self-control is what you do when no one is watching. There we are again, when no one's watching, when you think no one is around. As you'll see later on in this unit, people who allow themselves to lose self-control even once can find themselves in situations they regret for life. Now, Now, what is losing self-control? You know, um, I like to consider it as rather than losing it, you gave it. You gave it away. You gave the control away to someone else. Yeah, you lost it, but you made a choice to do that. There is no things. Well, you hear about a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, well, I did it and I wasn't thinking. Well, no, that's not true. You're always thinking. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I mean, our minds are moving, at split seconds so fast. The thoughts are coming into our head, and we're acting on it. Our feelings are being affected by it. Each and every thought that goes in there, and then what we do with it and the action we take is up to us. We have to make that choice. We have to make that choice to knock that thought out of our head. We have to make that choice not to let it affect our emotions. And if it gets that far, then we have to at least make the choice not to let it affect our actions. So the thought might have kicked on the emotions a little bit, but let's back it up. Let's still. You don't have to just let go completely. You don't have to give it away. You don't have to make that choice. Jump on it. Jump on it, man. Get the thoughts under control. Get it all under control. You don't have to be mad. You don't have to yell. You don't have to scream. You don't have to fight. That's a choice you make after you've had the thoughts and the feelings. You don't have to do it. You don't have to talk about someone else. You don't have to say mean, cruel, wicked things about someone else to someone, trying to bring them down and belittle them and tear down their character. That's murder. Murder is what that is. So you actually take their life away, or you're trying to take their life away when you do those things. So as you'll see later on in this unit, people who allow themselves and make that choice to lose self-control, even once, can find themselves in situations they regret for life. Things get back to people, and people have lost jobs, people have lost life, people have lost property, all because of that little thing right there in the middle of your mouth, that tongue. I mean, we've got to learn to control that thing, and that's one of the hardest things there is to control. I've talked to a lot of people that stopped drinking, abusing alcohol, stopped abusing drugs, and many other negative behavior that hurt people all their lives, and they stopped. They stopped. They quit completely and changed their life. But even though that took place, that tongue is the one that still kind of eludes the taming, taming that tongue. And so that's why self-control is so critical, that we learn how to practice it consistently in every situation. Yeah, we're going to make mistakes. Yeah, we're going to make bad choices. We're going to do stupid things and say stupid things, but we have got to remember to not only, I'm going back to, once again, room to grow. We have to not only leave ourselves room to grow and not kick ourselves too much. We need to give ourselves a nice swift little kick, to remember about it, but we don't need to dwell on it so much that we go into depression and everything. We need to remember that this is the peaceful solution. The peaceful solution helps us deal with these things. And, even the person that is having the negative behavior exhibited towards them, that person can help the person that's exhibiting the negative behavior by being positive in return. And that's when growth takes place. How many times has a negative situation been diffused because there was someone positive around that has a smile on their face and didn't join in the anger and the hatred and the name calling and everything else? How many times has it been turned around? I mean, if you have a smile on your face, there's really nothing there for the person. the person that wants to get a reaction out of you, there's nothing there for him if you don't give it to him, you know. That's what's neat about the peaceful solution, man. We learn these things, and yeah, again, we make mistakes sometimes, you know, all of us. I'm speaking of myself too. Um, you know, and we let that mouth, remember, you know, that tongue is so hard to tame, man. Uh, but as long as we can look at it, you know, and go back and visit what we did and realize it was wrong or right, you know. But if it was wrong, we correct the situation. We go back and we, you know, apologize and 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 until that apology takes place, there's not going to be any change. Until you go to the person that you've got a problem with and you make it right, talk to the person about it. There's not going to be any change, you know. Because most of the time, whatever it is that you have against the person, that person isn't even aware of it, you know. You're going along carrying this around with you and causing health problems and everything else, and the other person's just going along every day about their business. You know? And remember, well, you know, in the peaceful solution, we're taught that, you know, holding a grudge against somebody and not taking care of it, it's like you drinking a glass of poison and waiting for the other person to die. You know, it's stupid. All right? So anyway, I think it's said enough about that. You know, we're talking about respect and self-control and how they go hand in hand and the consistency of self-control. So everyone has areas in their lives where practicing self-control can benefit them. For example, some people would like to be more organized or to manage their anger better. Yeah? You know, anger is a normal thing. It's a secondary emotion that lets you know that there's something going on that you don't agree with, you know. It's when you get that kind of, you know, you disagree, you know, but the thing is you got to manage that. You got to manage that before it turns to some type of, you know, rage or holding a grudge or something like that. You just got to manage it. And that's what the peaceful solution teaches us to do. So it really can benefit us so much in dealing with this anger. You know, it can help us manage other things too. You know, it takes self-control not to overeat. Some people overeat, even though they know they shouldn't. It's bad for their heart. It's bad for their liver. It's bad for their gut. It's bad for their brain. And they just load on, man. Start eating and they load up. And they might not even have the monetary ability to eat that much, but yet, you know, they lose control and they just go for it. It can help us, you know, the peaceful solution can. I see that the suggestion there, it could help us be more organized. You know, I'm still working on that part of it myself even. You know, not that I'm not working on all the other parts too, I am. But I mean, the being more organized part is definitely one that I have in my mind, you know, a lot of the time on trying to be more organized. So in what areas of your life can practicing self-control benefit you? And it says list 3 ways on the lines below. Okay, so, you know, hopefully if you've got a book, you've already listed some things on the lines. If not, feel free to jot them down. You know, think about what we're talking about. You know, if you need to stop for a moment and think about something you heard here or in any of the classes, you know, from the teachers that you know, we've experienced a lot of things in teaching the peaceful solution with, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. You know, some things we don't even remember until, you know, the right thing snaps in our mind. You know, possibly, you know, someone might have a question or something that triggers that thought in our mind, and we remember something that took place at one of the venues or some of the classes that we've taught, you know, and the interactions. It's really interesting, the things that you learn from the students also. So keep that in mind as you're training to be a teacher, is to keep an open mind in dealing with the students, and you be the example. Even if a student has something, some kind of negative thing against you, you know, and you hear about it and everything, be the example, you know, treat them kindly. Don't give them any reason to have those thoughts about you. Let's go on to page 10. And remember, we've already looked at our lesson plan, and we're going on to page 10 here. Let's go back to it real quick. Lesson plan 1, page F, procedure 3. So self-control develops other traits, found on page 10. We're reading that. And it says to complete the exercises at the bottom of the page. Discuss answers with the class. And this is where you can get a lot of understanding when you have a venue where you're able to do that. A small classroom or something, it really does help. Or even family. You can teach the peaceful solution to your family, or friends. Friends can gather around and have a peaceful solution class together. I saw a group of boys, teenage, preteen to mid-teen, having a class yesterday, in fact. They just broke out the books, and there was 4 or 5 of them up towards the front of this very room right here, and they were holding their own class rather than acting foolish, I thought it was a great thing myself. I mean, you can do that at any time, Hey, maybe there's 3 or 4 of you that'd like to get together with the books and have an impromptu peaceful solution class, So, stress to students the importance of practicing self-control in order to develop other positive character traits. Well, we have definitely mentioned that in dealing with respect, for instance, and our conduct when we're dealing with other people, property, and the environment. But again, remember that self-control is the foundation. It really is the first step in learning to put all of this knowledge, put all this information to work in your life, because you have to have self-control to practice any of this. You have to. You had to have self-control when you picked up the book. You had to have self-control when you came to the class, So it is so extremely important if we can learn to develop it to where we can use it all the time in a positive manner. So self-control develops other traits. This is page 10. Developing and practicing self-control will enable you to develop many other positive traits. Right, developing and practicing self-control will enable you to. Self-control is the foundation of a positive character. For example, we just talked about this. For example, it takes self-control to be responsible. Responsible people complete all tasks to the best of their ability. Doesn't mean they're not going to fail sometimes, If a person fails and doesn't get back up, then that's the failure. That's the irresponsibility. If you fail at something and you get back up and you go at it again, you are being responsible. That's what responsibility is. You're going to have setbacks from time to time. The responsible person looks at it. There might be a little bit of hurt there for a minute or something, or give yourself that quick kick, but get over it. And a responsible person, takes care of it. They go back and try again. They might fail again, but you know what they do? They go back and try again if it's the right thing. And so that's what it is with this self-control. We're going to make those mistakes. We're going to make some bad choices along the way, and we just need to, we need to go back and look and see what we did, where we went wrong, and we need to try it again and again and again and again. And eventually, we'll be doing it right more of the time. So these responsible people, they're willing to make sacrifices to fulfill their obligations. Sacrifices to fulfill obligations. They're obligated to do something. Some other influence comes along. They might be wanting to do something differently, but they have an obligation to carry on and do this certain thing. And they're responsible enough to do it. So rather than neglecting their duties, responsible people stop and consider what needs to be done. Remember on that page back there on page 7, it says, why do I need to have self-control? And then it has the little stop sign there. It says stop and think. Well, that's what's going on. That's what they're talking about right here. It's, it says right there, responsible people stop and consider what needs to be done. Then they make a positive choice to fulfill those obligations to the best of their ability. And, they might have had to adjust what they feel is the best of their ability. They might see that, oh, man, I bit off a little bit more than I could chew here. I need to get some help. I need to go and see who I'm dealing with here and see if we can make some adjustments or something, you know. But they want to fulfill these obligations to the best of their ability. It also takes self-control to be respectful, especially when someone is not respecting you. So that's the one right there, man. That's the one that I would venture to say we all still have a problem with to some degree. You know, when someone's not respecting you, the easiest thing is to jump back in their face, you know. But it doesn't work. To diffuse the situation and to calm things down, if someone's disrespecting you, the best thing you can do is not disrespect them. And it'll calm the situation down. They got nowhere to go. They got no reaction coming from you like they would expect. So you're teaching them then how to conduct themselves. Let's do some teaching like that. That'd be really cool. You know, someone comes up and disrespects you, or someone's saying something that's disrespectful about you, and you know, it'd be really great to not join in with that and be disrespectful in return. So if someone disrespects you, the easiest thing to do would be to get even and disrespect them in return. However, taking revenge is not showing self-control, nor is it showing respect, nor is it showing care and concern. Well, which is what respect is. Nor is it showing compassion or empathy. Self-control means to stop and consider that retaliation will lead to more disrespect. You know, if you don't believe that, think about it for a minute. Go watch the news. What do you see? You know, I mean, so you see all these border troops amassing, you know, Ukraine, and you see all these countries coming and bringing more troops and more stuff in, and yeah, we're going to put sanctions on Russia. We're going to do this. We're going to do that, and they're getting ready for a fight. And I was watching a interview with the president of Ukraine just yesterday, I believe it was. And you know, he was sitting there kind of calm and cool, and he goes, you know, this stuff goes on all the time, really. I mean, we're just kind of kick back and wait and see exactly how far it goes. So if everybody could calm down, we know more about what's going on with this situation than all y'all do. You know, he's given a talk to a foreign journalists that had gathered, right? And he was really telling them in a very nice way, you guys, man, kick back. We're not too worried about it right now. We're going to wait and see. We know what's going on. We've been here all this time. Y'all are just now coming over here seeing what's up, you know. So I would say he was practicing a lot of self-control at that time. Self-control means to stop and consider that retaliation will lead to more disrespect, hate, and animosity where you, the other person, or even an innocent bystander could get hurt. We see that all the time, where somebody shoots somebody and a stray bullet, it could even be the police shooting somebody and a stray bullet goes through the wall and kills some 6-year-old girl or something, you know. The family did not start out that day thinking they were going to lose their child. Devastation in people's lives occur because of something like that right there. Can you imagine the family, what they're going to go through for many, many years to come? I mean, people even, you know, take their own lives over things like that. They never can really get over it. They could if they had the peaceful solution, but it would still be a very hard thing. And so you see how that carelessness and the hatred and the wanting to get even or, you know, hurt somebody can go too far. By becoming a person who has self-control, you will be able to consider all of these things and then make a choice not to take revenge. You know, not to take revenge. Not to take revenge. Responsibility and respect are only two of the many character traits that can be developed if you have self-control. Okay, so consider these traits right here. This is really the answer to it. If you want to be able to have that self-control that would allow you to not jump back and take revenge to somebody, not jump back in their face, no matter what they said about you, no matter who they said it in front of, and you're thinking, man, people are going to think this about me now and all this, and if you really want to be able to handle that situation and it never occur again, this is what you need to develop. Consider the traits of compassion, humility, and patience. The character traits of compassion, humility, and patience. The character traits of compassion, humility, and patience. I would venture to say if you had an overabundance of any one of those three things, you could stand up against taking revenge. Or stand down, I should say. How about that? You could stand down in that situation where someone's being very disrespectful to you, and you think that you need to stand up for your rights and stand up and let people know this person's wrong, this is not what's going on, and raise your voice and start all that. Because if you have compassion, look at the bottom of the page there. Compassion. Self-control will help you think of what the other person is going through and think of their needs above your own. You will want to relieve their suffering. So then if you throw some empathy in there and walk a mile in their shoes, you might not know much about that person at the time, but yet you might. You might know a lot about the person that's belittling you and calling you names or making you look small in people's eyes all around or something, If you can practice that compassion and empathy and think about where that person came from and what they've gone through, and then just stand down and realize that, man, shoot, I haven't been through anything like this guy's been through. If he wants to get it off his chest for a minute, okay. I don't like it, but okay. And then look at humility. Self-control will help you to resist the temptation to rise up against authority. Not only a person that is belittling you or something, and you might think the authority is, but some people rise up against authority without any belittling or anything going on. It might be imaginary. Insist on fulfilling only your needs. The temptation to rise up against authority, insisting on fulfilling only your needs, and consider the needs of others. Consider the needs of others. That's what it is. Self-control will help you to resist that temptation of going up against the authority and fulfilling your own needs, but it'll help you consider the needs of others. And then patience. Wow. Okay, patience, another definition of patience is to suffer. Look it up in the dictionary, to suffer. All right? So if that person is belittling you in front of everybody, you now have the opportunity to practice patience. You now have that opportunity to suffer a little bit and throw that empathy and compassion and humility in there, and you can practice that patience. Self-control will help you to maintain your composure and temper when others frustrate you, or, now this says make you angry, but as we know, no one makes you angry. You allow that to take place. You see that there's something there you don't agree with, and you get that initial little bit of anger, that little thing going on, letting you know that you don't agree with it, and then you carry on further than that, but that's you making the choice to do that. Nobody is making you do it, okay? So I'd like to stop right there at the bottom of page 10. Our next class will be starting on page 11, probably with a little bit of review, and that'll be Chris that will be doing that. I think would that be when is our next class? Is it on Sunday? I don't think we're having class this 2-5, 2-6. So okay, so on 2-6 is our next class. Okay, on February 6th is our next class. Got it? 5:30. Everyone be here. It'll be a great class. Chris will be here, giving us some more information. And by the way, that's great, man. Guard your mind right there. He'll have a lot to talk about. So come on and see us. We thank you for being here tonight and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.